The compass tattoo on Mark's forearm was a drunken mistake from 9 years ago. He hadn't thought about the woman who matched it in almost as long. Then 3 identical 7-year-old boys in designer coats walked up to him at a dusty playground and tore his quiet, calloused life apart. Mark didn't believe in serendipity. He believed in the structural integrity evoked the inescapable reality of property taxes, and the fact that a 6-year-old boy could survive on nothing but chicken nuggets and sheer chaotic willpower. It was a Tuesday afternoon and the air in the park tasted of damp earth and exhaust fumes from the nearby interstate. Mark sat on a splintering green bench, a lukewarm paper cup of bitter coffee in his rough hands. The sawdust ingrained in his skin made his fingers feel like sandpaper. He ran a custom furniture repair shop out of a converted garage. A polite way of saying he spent his days gluing rich people's antique chairs back together while trying to keep his own life from falling apart. His son Luke was currently buried up to his elbows in the sandbox, aggressively trying to force a plastic dump truck to consume a rock. "Don't eat the sand, Luke," Mark called out, his voice carrying the low, gravelly rasp of a man who chronically slept 4 hours a night. Luke didn't look up, but the rock dropped from his hand. Small victories. Mark leaned back, rolling the sleeves of his faded flannel shirt up past his elbows to let the autumn breeze hit his skin. The cold felt good against the dull ache in his joints. His left forearm bore a tattoo, a jagged, imperfect compass, with the North Star missing, heavily scarred over from the amateur who had needled it into him 9 years ago in a dimly lit parlor that smelled of green soap and stale beer. He rubbed it absently. It was a nervous habit, tracing the raised ink when the exhaustion hit him the hardest. The park was mostly empty, save for a distracted nanny in scrubs on her phone near the swings, and 3 little boys walking in unison near the oak trees. Mark barely noticed them at first. He was too busy calculating whether he could stretch his remaining bank balance to cover Luke's impending dental bill and the overdue electric notice. But the boys were impossible to ignore for long. They moved with an eerie coordinated precision. Triplets. They looked to be about 7 or 8 years old. They wore identical charcoal wool peacoats with heavy brass buttons, pristine white trousers, and patent leather shoes that had no business being in a public park. Their dark hair was cut into sharp identical cuts. They looked like they had wandered out of a high-end European fashion catalogue and into the gritty reality of municipal landscaping. They stopped about 10 feet from Mark's bench. Mark frowned, lowering his coffee cup. He glanced around looking for their parents. The nanny by the swings was still furiously texting, completely oblivious. The boy in the middle took a step forward. His eyes were a piercing stormy grey. It was a cold color, jarring on a child. "Hello, sir," he said. His voice was polite, clipped, and devoid of the usual childish hesitation. "Hey," Mark said slowly, sitting up straighter. "You kids lost your mom or dad around?" The boy on the left tilted his head, his gaze dropping to Mark's bare muscular forearm resting on his knee. "Our mother is at work," the middle boy continued, stepping closer. The smell of expensive, subtle lavender detergent wafted off their coats, completely masking the smell of the park's damp leaves. The boy on the right pointed a small gloved finger at Mark's arm. "Our mother has a tattoo just like yours." Mark froze. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently unpleasant. The blood drained from his face, dropping like a stone into his steel-toed boots. A high, thin ringing sound started in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of traffic and the squeak of the playground swings. "Just like yours," he looked down at his arm. The jagged compass, the missing star. It wasn't a piece of flash art off a parlor wall. It was custom. He had drawn it himself on a grease-stained napkin in a dive bar in Seattle, laughing with a woman whose face he had spent the last 9 years trying to scrub from his memory. "What did you say?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. He felt a sudden sharp nausea. The coffee in his stomach turned to acid. "The compass," the middle boy said, unfazed by the sudden intensity radiating from the large, calloused man. "Hers is on her shoulder. The top point is broken." Mark's hands began to shake. He placed his coffee cup on the bench before he crushed it. It wasn't possible. It was a statistical impossibility. It was a cruel joke played by an indifferent universe. "What's your mother's name?" Mark asked. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. Before the boys could answer, a panicked voice shrilled across the grass. "Silas Rowan Jude." The distracted nanny was sprinting toward them, her phone shoved hastily into her pocket. She looked terrified, her face flushed red. She reached the boys and immediately began herding them backward by their shoulders. "I am so sorry, sir," the nanny gasped, looking at Mark's worn clothes and tattooed arms with a flash of blatant, unapologetic judgment. "They aren't supposed to wander." "Wait," Mark said, standing up. He was 6 feet 2 inches, broad-shouldered from years of hauling timber. The nanny visibly flinched, pulling the boys tighter against her legs. "We have to go," the nanny snapped. "The car is waiting. Come along, boys. Miss Sterling will be furious if we are late." Sterling. The name hit Mark like a physical blow to the sternum. He couldn't breathe. He took a half step forward, his hand outstretched, but the nanny was already briskly marching the triplets toward the park entrance. The middle boy, Silas Rowan, or Jude, he didn't know which, looked back over his shoulder at him. His stormy grey eyes locked onto his one last time, before they disappeared behind a rusted chain-link fence, climbing into the back of an idling, blacked-out SUV. "Dad." Mark flinched. He looked down. Luke was standing by the bench, wiping a dirty hand across his forehead, leaving a streak of mud. "You okay, Dad? You look like you're going to throw up." Mark swallowed hard-tasting bile and old coffee. He reached out and placed a heavy trembling hand on his son's small shoulder. "I'm fine, Luke." Mark lied, his voice hollow. "Come on, we need to go home." The apartment smelled of boiling pasta water and old dust. It was a cramped 2-bedroom, above a dry cleaner vibrating faintly every time the commercial presses downstairs engaged. Mark sat at the scratched laminate kitchen table, the glow of his battered laptop illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He had put Luke to bed an hour ago, reading Where the Wild Things Are with a monotone voice. While his mind raced 1,000 miles an hour, he took a pull from a bottle of cheap beer. It was warm, but he didn't care. He needed something to anchor him to reality, because the screen in front of him was pulling him into a surreal nightmare. The search bar read Sterling Triplets. There were dozens of articles, high society blogs, financial profiles, paparazzi snaps. Mark clicked on a profile from a major business publication. The headline glared back at him. "The Iron Architect: How Harper Sterling Built a Logistics Empire Before 35. Below it was a high-resolution photograph. Mark stared at the screen, his breath hitching. He recognized the sharp jawline. He recognized the dark hair now styled into a severe, immaculate cut rather than the tangled, salty waves he remembered. But most of all, he recognized the eyes, the stormy, cynical grey eyes that had looked up at him in the park just hours ago. 9 years ago, she hadn't been Harper Sterling billionaire CEO. She had been Hannah. He remembered the smell of the Seattle rain on her jacket. He remembered the cheap whiskey they had shared from a plastic cup in a motel room that smelled of stale smoke. They were two strangers running from their own messes. Mark from a spectacular failure of a marriage that had left him with a newborn son and a mountain of debt. And Hannah from, well, she had never said. She had just said she needed to disappear for 48 hours. They had gotten the tattoos on a dare, a permanent mark to remember a weekend that didn't exist in the real world, a broken compass because neither of them knew where they were going. Mark rubbed his face with both hands, pressing his palms hard into his eye sockets until sparks bloomed in the darkness. If the boys were 7, maybe 8 years old, the math was a brutal, undeniable equation. 9 years ago, the timeline fit with terrifying precision. Are they mine? The thought made his stomach violently contract. He shoved the chair back, the wooden leg screeching against the peeling linoleum, and walked to the kitchen sink. He turned on the cold water and splashed it over his face, gasping at the shock. He gripped the edges of the sink, staring out the small window into the dark alleyway. If he was the father, why had she never told him? He knew the answer before the question even fully formed. They hadn't exchanged last names. They had used burner phones. They had constructed a perfect isolated bubble of anonymity. She couldn't have found him even if she wanted to. But she was Harper Sterling. If she had really wanted to find a blue-collar woodworker from Oregon, a billionaire's resources could have done it. He walked back to the table and scrolled further down the article. It detailed her ruthless takeover of her father's failing shipping company, her aggressive expansion into autonomous supply chains, and her fiercely guarded private life. It mentioned she was a single mother to triplets, no mention of a father, no mention of a husband. Mark clicked on an image gallery. He scrolled through photos of Harper at galas and boardrooms, stepping out of helicopters. She looked like she was encased in armor. High-collared blouses, tailored blazers that cost more than Mark's truck. Then he found it. A candid shot from a charity ball 3 years ago. She was wearing a backless evening gown, turning away from the camera in annoyance. Right there on her left shoulder blade, the jagged lines of the broken compass. Mark closed the laptop with a sharp snap. He didn't want this. He had built a fragile, quiet life for himself and Luke. They had a routine. They had stability, even if it was perched on the edge of a financial cliff. Injecting a billionaire CEO and 3 sudden sons into the mix wasn't just complicated. It was a bomb waiting to detonate everything he had managed to salvage. He should walk away. He should delete his search history, forget the grey eyes of the little boy in the park, and go back to sanding down mahogany cabinets tomorrow morning. But the memory of the needle buzzing against his skin, the memory of her cynical bruised laugh in that dark motel room gnawed at his ribs. He was a father. He knew the bone-deep terrifying responsibility of it. If those boys were his flesh and blood living in some glass tower with a woman who had walled herself off from the world, could he really just turn his back? He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked spiderweb across the glass. He opened his browser and searched for the corporate headquarters of Sterling Logistics. It was downtown, a 40-minute subway ride from his neighborhood. Mark set the phone down. He looked at his scarred forearm. He didn't want money. He didn't want a piece of her empire. But he needed to look her in the eyes. He needed to know if the ghost in the ink was real. The Sterling Logistics building was a monolithic slab of black glass and steel that absorbed the weak Thursday morning sunlight. It loomed over the financial district, a physical manifestation of cold, silent power. Mark stood on the pavement outside, hyper-aware of his own skin. He wore his best clothes, unripped dark denim, clean work boots, a heavy canvas jacket over a grey Henley. To him it was a respectable uniform. In the shadow of the Sterling Tower, Amidst a stream of executives in worsted wool and Italian leather, he looked like a trespasser. He smelled of cheap Irish spring soap and the faint stubborn tang of turpentine that lived permanently under his fingernails. He took a breath of city ozone, roasted nuts, cold concrete, and pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby was a cavern of polished white marble. Footsteps clicked sharply, echoing off the high ceilings. The climate control was aggressive, carrying a sterile synthetic citrus scent. Mark approached the massive curved reception desk. The security guard, a man whose suit strained over massive shoulders, instantly zeroed in on Mark's scuffed boots. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked. She wore a sleek headset and a polite, dead-eyed smile. "I need to see Harper Sterling," Mark said. His voice, gravelly and low, scraped against the hushed acoustics of the room. The receptionist's smile didn't waver. "Do you have an appointment, Mr.?" Mark said no, "Just tell her Mark is here." The security guard shifted his weight, closing the distance by a half step. "Miss Sterling's schedule is booked months in advance. We don't do walk-ins." "I'm not leaving," Mark stated. He didn't raise his voice, but his feet planted firmly on the marble. The sudden dense stillness in his posture made the guard's hand twitch toward a radio clipped to his belt. Mark ignored the guard and looked at the receptionist. "Do you have a piece of paper and a pen?" Reluctantly, she slid a branded notepad and a heavy metal pen across the counter. Mark's handwriting was an ugly scrawl trained for marking measurements on rough lumber, not writing correspondence. He wrote 4 words. "I have the compass." He folded it and pushed it back. "Send this up. If she tells you to throw me out after she reads it, I'll walk out myself." "No trouble." The receptionist exchanged a glance with the guard who gave a minute shrug. She scanned the note into a sleek desktop terminal, typing a quick message. "I've forwarded it to her executive assistant," she said, her tone dripping with dismissal. "But I highly doubt." The phone on her desk emitted a sharp singular chime, a direct line. She pressed her earpiece. For a fraction of a second, the corporate mask slipped, revealing naked shock. "Yes, Immediately, she lowered her hand, looking at Mark as if he had defied the laws of physics. "Mr. Mark, the private elevator on the right, floor 72. Security will escort you." The elevator ride was aggressively fast, making Mark's ears pop. The guard stood rigid beside him, radiating silent hostility. When the stainless steel doors hissed open, Mark stepped into a space that felt less like an office and more like a high-altitude fortress. Floor 72 featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering a dizzying grey panorama of the city. The carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of his heavy boots. Original intimidating abstract art lined the walls. The air smelled of bergamot and expensive black tea. At the far end, behind a desk made of a single slab of raw-edge walnut resting on glass blocks, stood Harper Sterling. She was turned away looking out at the skyline. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that hung flawlessly over her frame. "Leave us," she commanded. The cadence was exactly the same as a woman in the cheap Seattle motel, but the warmth had been completely bled out of it. The guard hesitated. Are you certain?" "Did I stutter?" "Marcus, get out." The doors clicked shut. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Slowly, Harper turned around. Mark's chest tightened. 10 years had left fine lines around her stormy grey eyes and a rigid defensive set to her jaw. She looked exhausted. She looked terrifying. She looked at his worn canvas jacket, his scuffed boots, and finally his face. A muscle feathered in her cheek. "You," she breathed. It wasn't a sigh of relief. It was an accusation. Me, Mark replied. She gripped the edge of her walnut desk, her knuckles bone white. How did you find me? How much do you want? The immediate jump to a shakedown stung. A hot defensive anger flared in Mark's gut. I don't want your money, he said, taking a slow step forward. I didn't even know who you were until Tuesday. I was at the park with my son. Harper flinched at the word son. 3 little boys walked up to me, Mark continued, his voice dropping into a harder register. They saw my arm. They told me their mother had the exact same tattoo. Harper closed her eyes. When she opened them, the vulnerability was sealed away behind a sheet of ice. They shouldn't have spoken to you. The nanny was fired. You fired a woman because your kids talked to a stranger. I fired her because she allowed a potential security threat to interact with my children. Harper snapped. The sudden volume cracked like a whip. She stepped out from behind the desk. Do you have any idea what my life is like? How many people try to get near them to get to me? I'm not a threat, Mark said, holding his calloused hands up, palms open. I needed to know. Know what? She mocked bitterly. If the drunken mechanic you slept with 9 years ago magically turned into a billionaire. I'm a carpenter, actually, Mark corrected flatly. And no, I needed to know if I'm a father. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Harper stopped moving. Her defensive posture suddenly looked brittle. The silence stretched out, filled only by the faint muffled wail of a siren 50 floors below. They are 9 years old, Mark said softly. The anger drained away, leaving only the crushing weight of the truth. We were in Seattle 9 years ago. The math isn't complicated, Hannah. Don't call me that, she whispered. Then tell me the truth. Harper walked to a sleek ivory leather sofa and sat down heavily. She crossed her arms tight over her chest, not looking at him. Yes, they are yours. The floor tilted. Mark had known it, but hearing it spoken aloud in the sterile, untouchable room made it a physical reality. 3 sons. He staggered slightly, dropping into a modern chrome chair opposite her. He rested his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his rough hands. He smelled the sawdust on his own skin. Why? Mark asked, his voice muffled. Why didn't you tell me? Find you where? Harper let out a short, harsh laugh. We didn't know each other's last names. We had burner phones. And even if I could have tracked you down. Why would I? Mark dropped his hand, staring incredulously. Because I'm their father. You were a guy I slept with for a weekend to escape the fact that my father was dying and my company was bleeding millions. She fired back. I was 24. I was terrified. You were an escape hatch, Mark. That's all. And when you found out you were pregnant with triplets, I dealt with it like I deal with everything else. Harper lifted her chin, the CEO persona sliding back into place. I built an empire. I provided them with a life you couldn't comprehend. They go to the best schools. They have trust funds. Their futures are guaranteed. Mark looked around the lifeless, immaculate office. He thought of his cramped apartment, the vibration of the dry cleaner downstairs, the constant gnawing anxiety over grocery bills. I don't care about their trust funds, Mark said quietly. I had a right to know they existed. And what would you have done? Harper challenged, leaning forward. Fought me for custody. We live in 2 different universes. Mark, you dragging yourself into their lives now is just going to confuse them. They are the ones who walked up to me. They know something is connecting us. Harper looked away, her jaw tight. They are incredibly observant. What are their names? She hesitated, looking at his battered hands. Silas, Rowan, Jude. Which one was in the middle? The one who spoke. Silas, he's the oldest by 4 minutes. He's the protector. Mark nodded slowly. He rubbed the scarred compass on his arm. He was looking across a vast chasm of wealth at a woman who held 3 of his children behind walls of money. So, Mark said, his voice ragged. What now? Harper stood up, walking back behind her massive walnut desk, re-establishing the physical barrier. Now, she said, her tone absolute. You walk out that door. You go back to your life and you pretend this never happened. Mark stared at her. He slowly stood up, his large frame uncoiling. The anger he had pushed down began to simmer again, hot and heavy. You think it's that easy? He asked. I can make it very easy, Harper replied, her grey eyes flat. Or I can make it incredibly difficult. Your choice. Mark didn't break eye contact. The worn splintered wood of his life was colliding with the cold, unbreakable glass of hers, and he knew with terrifying clarity that he wasn't going to back down. For 3 days the roar of the belt sander was the only thing keeping Mark from losing his mind. His workshop smelled of sharp pine burnt friction and the sour tang of old wood glue. Dust coated every surface, settling into the creases of his knuckles and the deep lines framing his mouth. He was working on a shattered cherrywood credenza, systematically stripping away a century of grime to find the solid grain underneath. It was a distraction. It wasn't working. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw grey eyes and white patent leather shoes. He heard the cold deadpan threat in Harper's voice. I can make it incredibly difficult. Mark turned off the sander. The sudden silence in the garage was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe in the corner. He wiped a grease-stained rag across his forehead, leaning heavily against his workbench. He was outmatched. He knew it. If Harper wanted to bury him in legal paperwork, she had a small army of retainers to do it. She could drain his non-existent savings in a week. But the thought of never seeing those 3 boys again, of letting them grow up, thinking the man with the matching compass was just some ghost who didn't care, made his chest physically ache. A heavy definitive crunch of tires on loose gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Mark looked up. A black, heavily tinted SUV had just pulled into his narrow, cracked driveway, dwarfing his rusted pickup truck. The engine cut out. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rear door opened. Harper stepped out into the overcast Friday afternoon. She was dressed down, which for her meant a charcoal cashmere turtleneck and dark, perfectly tailored trousers. She looked entirely alien in his driveway. She stepped carefully over a stray coil of copper wire, her eyes scanning the peeling paint of the garage, citing the battered metal trash cans, the absolute lack of security. She walked into the open bay of the workshop. The smell of the cashmere and subtle gardenia perfume clashed violently with the turpentine and sawdust. You didn't send a lawyer, Mark noted, tossing the dirty rag onto the bench. He didn't offer her a chair. The only one available was missing a leg. Lawyers leave paper trails, Harper said. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were darting around the shop, taking in the chaotic reality of how he lived. She stopped when she saw a child's drawing of a blue dog taped to the wall above the bandsaw. She reached into her sleek leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She dropped it on the workbench right on top of a pile of cherrywood shavings. It landed with a heavy thudding finality. What is this? Mark asked, not moving toward it. A solution, Harper said. It's a non-disclosure agreement, ironclad. You sign it, stating you will never approach me, my company, or my sons again. You will not claim paternity. You will not speak to the press. Mark's jaw tightened. And in exchange, inside the envelope is a cashier's check. She said, her gaze locking onto his. $2 million drawn from a private account. It's entirely untraceable. You can pay off whatever debts you have. You can move out of this place. You can set up a real life for your son. The air left Mark's lungs. 2 million. The number hit him like a physical blow. His mind instantly traitorously ran the calculations. Luke's dental surgery, the back taxes, the suffocating endless anxiety that woke him up at 3 a.m. every single night gnawing at his stomach. He could buy a house with a yard. He could send Luke to college without a second thought. All he had to do was erase himself. Harper watched him. She saw the hesitation. She saw the heavy, exhausted slump of his shoulders. She knew the leverage she held, and she was pressing it directly into his ribs. Mark looked at the envelope. He reached out his calloused, dust-covered fingers, brushing the smooth paper. He thought of Luke. He thought of the deep, quiet pride he felt when he managed to put a hot meal on the table, through nothing but the sweat of his own back. Then he thought of Silas, Rowan, and Jude. He thought of the missing star on the compass, the symbol of being hopelessly lost. Slowly Mark pulled his hand back. He looked up at Harper. The temptation was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anchor of resolve. "Take it back," he rasped. Harper's pristine mask slipped. Genuine shock rippled across her face. "Don't be an idiot, Mark. Look around you. You're drowning. I'm offering you a life raft. You're offering me a payoff to abandon my kids." Mark corrected his voice, dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "You think because I have sawdust on my boots, I don't have a soul. You think $2 million makes up for wiping myself out of their lives. They don't need you." Harper shot back, her voice, raising, echoing off the tin roof. "I give them everything. You give them things, Harper. You give them bodyguards and trust funds." Mark took a step toward her, closing the distance. But a 7-year-old boy walked up to a stranger in a park, because he was looking for a connection to a mother who's probably at work 90 hours a week. Harper flinched as if he had struck her. The blood drained from her face. "I don't want your money," Mark said softly. "I don't want custody. I know I can't give them what you can. I'm not trying to drag them into this garage and feed them boxed mac and cheese." "Then what do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer terrifying vulnerability. 1 hour, Mark said. "Neutral ground. Bring them. Let me look them in the eye. Tell them my name and let them know I exist. Let them know they aren't half ghost. After that, we figure it out step by step." Harper stared at him. She looked at the heavy envelope on the table, then up at his scarred forearm, the compass ink stark against his skin. She was a woman who had fought hostile takeovers and board mutinies without breaking a sweat. But right now, standing in a dusty garage, she looked utterly defeated by a man who refused to be bought. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just turned on her heel and walked back out into the grey afternoon, but she left the envelope on the bench. Mark watched her tail lights fade down the street. He picked up the envelope, walked over to the garbage can, threw it in unopened. The city's botanical conservatory was a massive dome of glass and steel, heavily humid, and smelling of wet soil, crushed ferns, and blooming jasmine. It was quiet on a Sunday morning, the air thick and warm. Mark sat on a stone bench near a sprawling banyan tree. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt, his hair combed, his hands scrubbed raw with pumice stone until the ingrained dirt was mostly gone. Beside him, Luke was swinging his legs, a half-eaten granola bar clutched in his fist. "So, I have brothers?" Luke asked, taking a massive bite. He seemed entirely unfazed by the concept. To a 6-year-old, the world was a series of random chaotic events. "Anyway, half-brothers." "Yeah, buddy," Mark said, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. "3 of them." "Are they cool?" "I don't know yet," Mark admitted, offering a tight, nervous smile. "We are going to find out." A soft, rhythmic clicking of footsteps on the flagstone path made Mark look up. Harper was walking toward them. She wore a simple beige trench coat, her hair pulled back into a loose clasp. The armor was stripped back. She looked tired. She looked human. Trailing slightly behind her were the triplets. They wore matching denim overalls and yellow sweaters, an obvious forced attempt at casual wear, though their posture was still rigidly straight. Mark stood up. He wiped his palms on his jeans. Harper stopped a few feet away. She looked at Mark, then down at Luke, who was chewing loudly and staring at the boys with wide, unabashed curiosity. "Go, boys," Harper said, her voice softer than Mark had ever heard it. "This is Mark, and this is his son, Luke." The triplets stared. It was unnerving, the synchronized weight of 3 identical pairs of grey eyes. Silas, the one in the middle, stepped forward. He didn't look at Mark's face. He looked at his left arm. The sleeves of his flannel were rolled up. The jagged compass was visible. "You didn't take the money," Silas said. Mark choked on a breath. He looked up at Harper, horrified. Harper offered a faint defensive shrug. "I told you they are incredibly observant. They overhear things." Mark crouched down, his knees popping in the quiet greenhouse. He was now eye level with Silas. He didn't try to smile. He just looked at him with steady, grounded honesty. "No," Mark said softly. "I didn't." "Why?" Rowan asked, stepping up beside his brother. $2 million is a high-yield asset. You could have generated a 5% annual return. Mark blinked momentarily, derailed by the financial terminology coming out of a 7-year-old. He let out a short, rough laugh. "Because some things aren't for sale," Mark said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out 3 small objects and held his hand open. Resting on his calloused palm were 3 wooden medallions carved from the cherry wood he had been sanding the day Harper visited. They were polished smooth, the rich red grain glowing in the diffused greenhouse light. Engraved into each one was a compass. But unlike the tattoo on his arm or the one on their mother's shoulder, these compasses were whole. The North Star was firmly in place. "I make things," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's what I do. I fix what's broken. I can't fix the last 7 years. I wasn't there, but I'm here now." He offered the wood to them. For a long moment, no one moved. The air in the conservatory felt incredibly heavy. Then Jude, the quietest of the 3, reached out with a small pale hand and took one of the medallions. He traced the carved star with his thumb. "It smells like campfire," he whispered. "That's cherrywood," Luke chimed in, hopping off the bench. "My dad smells like that all the time. Sometimes he smells like glue, too. Do you guys like frogs? I saw a really big one over by the water lilies." The formal rigid posture of the boys faltered. They looked at Luke, then at their mother. Harper swallowed hard. The ice in her eyes had completely melted, leaving behind a sheen of unshed tears. She gave them a microscopic nod. We have not observed many frogs," Silas said, his clipped tone softening just a fraction. "Come on," Luke said, already walking down the path. "I'll show you." His fat. Hesitantly, the three boys followed the chaotic 6-year-old down the stone path toward the artificial pond. Mark stood up slowly. He watched them go, the heavy knot in his chest finally, painfully beginning to loosen. He turned to look at Harper. She was watching the boys. Her arms crossed tight against her chest. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly brushed it away, embarrassed. "They are beautiful, Hannah," Mark said quietly. Harper let out a shaky breath. She didn't correct his use of the name this time. "They are difficult," she corrected softly. "They argue in Latin. They critique my stock portfolio, and they terrify the household staff." "Good?" Mark smiled, a genuine crooked grin. "They'll need to be tough." He didn't move to hug her. He didn't reach for her hand. The chasm between their worlds was still there, vast and complicated. He was still the mechanic in the dusty garage. She was still the queen of a glass tower. There would be custody lawyers eventually. There would be fights, awkward holidays, and massive culture clashes. But as Mark watched Luke point excitedly at a lily pad surrounded by three boys in identical yellow sweaters holding carved cherrywood compasses, he knew the map had finally been redrawn. They weren't lost anymore. Thank you so much for watching the final chapters of this story. If Mark's fight to be a father touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a grounded emotional drama, and subscribe to our channel for more deep character-driven stories. What did you think of Harper's ultimate decision? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.